All right, we're live. Hello to everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our MindCORE seminar series. We are thrilled to be joined by Tim Bain. I'm not going to introduce him because I'm going to introduce the person who's introducing him, who is Professor Lisa Meraki, who you may have seen that last week as well. One little housekeeping thing that I would like to cover is that in order to ask a question, there's a tool called the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to post a question at any point during the talk. And you can also upvote questions that have been posted there, and the ones that are at the top are the ones that are usually asked first. And if there are a lot of questions, the ones that are usually asked of the speaker. That was maybe more confusing than it should have been. Let's see. Also, you're welcome to use the chat function, and you can post if they're just basic questions about how things operate. Feel free to put them there. And also, please share your appreciation for our speaker there. So, as I will stop speaking and then now turn it over to Professor Lisa Meraki for our introductions.
Thanks, Heather. Hi, everybody. Hi, everyone. I'm hearing some feedback. Are other people here? Okay, I think we're better now. Great. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Tim Bain today. He is a professor of philosophy at Monash University, and he works widely on interdisciplinary issues having to do with consciousness, with its nature, and what might give rise to it, and how science might explain it. His 2010 book, The Unity of Consciousness, was very influential on me. I really appreciate the way he so carefully thinks about all of the issues, but especially focuses on consciousness as it pertains to whole agents. I feel like that can often be lost in the discussion, and so that's one of the things that he does that I really appreciate. Another personal thing is that when I was a postdoc, we met, and he included me on some interdisciplinary panels having to do with how we could know whether patients with brain damage are conscious. And that got me that was really formative for me. I had lots of experiences as an early career person just out of the gate that Tim is responsible for, and I really appreciate it. I hope we are all very appreciative of Tim because he is speaking to us from Melbourne, Australia, and where it is not only 4 o'clock in the morning, but it is 4 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, which means he is taking a weekend very, very early in the morning to talk to us about how to measure consciousness. So without further ado, I will turn it over. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks very much, Lisa. I'm getting a bit of feedback, so I'll just keep going, but it's a bit distracting if it could be knocked down. That's great. So I'm going to talk today. Actually, I will turn my volume down because I'm getting everything I say back to me. Okay, how's that? That's a bit better. So I'm going to talk today about measuring consciousness, what I'm going to call a somewhat pretentious title, I guess, of the quest for a consciousness meter, which I hope it does tackle or address the focus for the seminar that you have, big unanswered questions about the mind. I'm not going to answer everything to do with this question, but I'm going to certainly tackle, I'm certainly going to put on the table what I regard as one of the biggest unanswered questions about the mind. And just before I get going, let me say that some of this work, pretty much all of it, is based heavily on a collaboration I've had with Nick Shea at the Institute for Philosophy in London. He's also based in Oxford. And in fact, many of these ideas are due to Nick. So when it comes to ascribing consciousness, to sort of detecting consciousness, I think there's a useful rough and ready distinction between easy cases and difficult cases. So the easy cases are neurotypical adult human beings. We don't always know what precise conscious states our fellow human beings are in, but we can pretty reliably tell whether or not someone is conscious. There are easy cases on the negative side. So we know that bricks aren't conscious. We know that even your most sophisticated cell phone is not conscious. But then there are the difficult cases, and these are the ones that occupy the attention of philosophers and scientists. As Lisa mentioned, there's a lot of interest, a lot of work being done on trying to detect consciousness in the context of brain damage, also in the context of sedation and anesthesia. There's questions about consciousness, the distribution of consciousness in the animal kingdom, birds, cephalopods, insects. Here's a particular interest of mine recently. This is my son, Otto, about a year ago. Before that, when he was before he was born, at about 19 weeks gestation. And one can ask, was Otto conscious then? Were there's the rudimentary beginnings of sentience or awareness at that point, or do they emerge only later? At what point in ontogeny does consciousness emerge? There's recently increased interest in consciousness in the context of cerebral organoids, the so-called mini brains that are grown in cultures in laboratories, which show that some oscillatory waves, some features that resemble the infant neonatal, the fetus in certain respects, that are perhaps suggestive of something like consciousness. And of course, there are questions about the distribution of consciousness or the possibility of artificial consciousness. So we know that AI systems have beaten humans in Jeopardy, in shogi, a Japanese version of chess, and in Go. No one thinks that AlphaZero or IBM's Watson are conscious, or very few people do. But there's increasing interest in the question of, how far away are we from artificial consciousness, and how would we tell whether an artificial system was conscious? So all of these cases raise questions about the distribution of consciousness. What's the, as it were, what's inside the circle of sentience and what's outside, and if there's organisms or systems that are right on the border of sentience, what are those systems as well? One way to think about these issues is that they really call out for a consciousness meter, which is just a fancy label, I guess, for a set of techniques, a set of tools for measuring the presence or absence of consciousness. The idea of a consciousness meter is basically, as I think of it, it's a device that allows us to go beyond our pre-theoretical ways of detecting consciousness, and we'll talk a little bit about what some of those pre-theoretical ways might be, and allow us to either justifiably supplement them. So there might be systems where our pre-theoretical ways, such as verbal report, just aren't appropriate. We can't, or intentional behavioral control. So in the fetus, you obviously can't ask the fetus whether it's conscious, and the fetus doesn't have the capacity for intentional behavioral control. So to either allow us to target systems and organisms that one can't get at using our ordinary pre-theoretical ways, or to override those. So our pre-theoretical measures might give us one verdict, say conscious, and one would like systems or measurement tools that enable us to overturn that verdict and say, no, that was our ordinary pre-theoretical verdict, but that verdict can be overturned. And there's a rough useful analogy here with biomarkers or signatures in medicine. So with various things, for example, if you think you might have COVID-19, there's pre-theoretical, as it were, measures, a runny nose, a fever, a cough, for example. And then there's a biomedical assay. There's the test that you can get, or a variety of tests, which might override those, as it were, everyday pre-theoretical markers. And we're familiar with this sort of system in medicine when it comes to various diseases. I'm going to focus on the generic property, the property of being conscious, because in some sense that's the most central case. But consciousness has a structure, and one can think about issues of measurement and detection at various levels of the structure. So there are also conscious contents. There's feelings of pain, there's perceptual states, there's emotional states, there's conscious thoughts. And one could look to detect those. So you might say, well, I know the creature's conscious, but is the creature in pain? Is what kind of emotional states might this creature have? And interleaved, as it were, between the generic property of consciousness and particular conscious contents are what some people call conscious levels. I prefer the term global states, which are, as it were, domain general ways in which consciousness is modulated. So people distinguish the state of ordinary waking awareness from the state of various sleep states of consciousness, for example, REM sleep, or the psychedelic state might be another, as it were, global state of consciousness. And you could focus on each of these three levels. You could focus on consciousness, which is where my focus is going to be. You could focus on conscious contents, or you could try and focus on the detection of the organism's conscious level or its global state. Now, talk of a consciousness meter is not new. It goes back to some of the earliest days of consciousness science, or at least the present incarnation of consciousness science. So here's, I don't know if you could, some of you might recognize this, the speaker here. This is an early version of Dave Chalmers, circa 1996. You can tell by the overhead projection and the handwritten slides. The instrument that he's holding in his right hand there is a hairdryer, which he's pretending is a consciousness meter. So he's saying, look, if we had a consciousness meter and we wanted to know whether I was conscious, you could just hold it up to my head and it would deliver a verdict, consciousness or not. And if you had such a thing, I could point it at someone in the audience and it would tell me whether or not you're conscious. Now, obviously, the big issue here is how do you validate a machine? So it's one thing for your hairdryer, for example, to be a consciousness meter. I mean, suppose that God's endowed your hairdryer with the property of, turning itself on when and only when it's pointed at a conscious creature. That hairdryer has this amazing property, but unless you're justified in thinking that it's got that property, you're not really justified in treating it as a consciousness meter. So it's one thing for a system to reliably correlate with the presence or absence of consciousness. It's another thing to know that it is. And the key question is validation. Can we validate a consciousness meter and or a putative consciousness meter, and if so, how? So here's Dave Chalmers with his, as it were, pretend consciousness meter, and I'm not going to go through it here, but in various places he's expressed a certain kind of skepticism, a principled skepticism about the very possibility of validating a consciousness meter. He says, we're sort of in principle cannot really get much beyond our pre-theoretical starting point, our pre-theoretical ways of measuring consciousness. I'm going to explore a couple of ways in which one might try and get beyond our pre-theoretical ways of measuring consciousness, a couple of ways of, as it were, responding to skepticism about the possibility of validating a consciousness meter. By engaging with the perturbational complexity index, which is, I think, the most sophisticated work that's out there in the science of consciousness, looking at how to measure consciousness. So the PCI, as it's known, has been developed by a fantastic neuroscientist, physiologist, Marcello Massimini at the University of Milan. It's going to take me a little bit of time to explain it. Some of the details matter and some of the details don't, but bear with me. We'll get back on track in 5 or 10 minutes once I've gone through the PCI. There's been a lot of enthusiasm for this work. So here's Christophe Koch, one of the leading consciousness scientists, with his column in Scientific American, saying, really talking it up, saying we've really got, as he says, an electromagnetic gadget to measure the level of consciousness. And Massimini doesn't really like his work being described as a consciousness meter, but it's certainly been talked about in that vein by people like Christophe Koch. So what do you do? What does Massimini do in his lab in Milan? So you take someone and you zap their brain, as it were, with TMS. So you perturb their brain. That's the that's the P in the PCI, that you perturb it. You look at the brain response to the perturbation, and you measure that by EEG, and then you look at the, as it were, the amount of information in that response and how compressible it is, basically, how complex it is given various ways of reducing informational complexity. And in principle, you could have sort of three types of brains, three types of systems that you might zap. You might have a complex brain, or a brain in a complex state. You might have a modular brain where there's not much interaction between the different components, the different parts of the brain. Or you might have a homogeneous brain where there's lots of interaction between the parts, but the interaction is pretty simple. Whereas in the complex brain, you've got lots of parts, there's lots of interaction between them, and the interactions, as it were, differentiated, as it's often put. Now, if you've got a complex brain and you zap it at one particular location, you'll get different kinds of responses at different points of measurement. So if you measure different nodes in the brain, some nodes will respond in some ways, other nodes will respond in other ways, some will respond immediately, some will have a delayed response. If you have a modular brain and you zap it at one point, because it's not widely connected, you'll only get responses at that node. And if you've got a homogeneous brain, the thought would be, and you zap it at one point, then lots of nodes are going to respond, but they're going to respond basically the same way. So you can compress that information. So if you're looking to kind of work out how complex is the response, you're going to get high complexity in the first case and low complexity in the cases 2 and 3. And the thought would be consciousness goes hand in glove with kind of informational complexity. That's the part of the motivation for this approach. And so you're not going to be able to compress the informational response very much in the first case. So it's going to have a high PCI. So if you're normalizing between 0 and 1, it's going to be 0.6, 0.7. And if you have the second and third kind of case, then you are going to be able to compress it, and you're going to have a low PCI response. That's the thought. So has PCI been validated? So has this technique? Let's assume that it's functioning as it were as a consciousness meter. Has it been validated? Do we have reason to trust it, to either allow it to tell us about the presence or absence of consciousness in cases where we can't apply our pre-theoretical measures, or do we have faith in the capacity for it to trump our pre-theoretical measures? So I want to answer this question by looking at two lines of validation that I see in the literature. One is sort of a theory-based approach. So part of what motivates the idea that the PCI is Giulio Tononi's quite influential integrated information theory of consciousness, which gives a key role to, as the very label suggests, integration in informational complexity to consciousness. So there's a theory-based motivation, theory-based validation for PCI, and I think Massimini, I think, would agree with me. IIT is controversial. I'm not going to go into the details here, but it's a controversial theory of consciousness. It's got influential advocates like Christophe Koch and Giulio Tononi, but it's also very controversial. And I've written elsewhere on some of the problems it faces. But more generally, any theory-based justification is problematic. At the moment, we don't have any well-grounded comprehensive theory of consciousness. So if you say, well, here's my consciousness meter, and it's justified on the basis of its fit with a certain theory of consciousness, well, you better be pretty justified in your theory, and we're not there yet. Now, in principle, of course, we might have a theory that has been, that we're so confident in that we can appeal to it to justify a putative consciousness meter. But certainly at the moment, I don't think we're there yet. So theory-based justification is one validation avenue, but I think it's problematic. Although the advocates of PCI do appeal to theory, they also focus most of their validation efforts on correlation. That's really where they think the heart of the approach is. So they appeal to correlations between the output of PCI and our ordinary pre-theoretical measures of consciousness as evidence that PCI is to be trusted. So let's talk about how this might go. And before I do that, I need to give you a bit of taxonomy for disorders of consciousness. So there's a rough and ready four-way distinction between sort of four states that are used in the clinical literature here. So one is the well-known vegetative state, often called the unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, where the thought is there's no behavioral evidence of consciousness. Typically, it's been assumed that there's no consciousness as well, in addition to the fact that there's no behavioral evidence of consciousness. But the move from the vegetative state to the unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, from the one label to the other label, is in part motivated by the thought that in significant number of cases, there might be consciousness even in the absence of behavioral evidence of consciousness. So that's one category. Then there's the minimally conscious state, where there's some minimal, perhaps inconsistent behavioral evidence of consciousness. Then there's a state which is labeled the emerged from minimally conscious state, where there's full consciousness, including communication. And those three states are known as disorders of consciousness and are usefully contrasted with the locked-in syndrome, where there's full awareness, full consciousness, but little to no capacity for behavioral control. So in some cases, there might be just the capacity to move the eye or blink. And in total locked-in cases, even that capacity is gone, at least for a period of time. Okay, so those are some relevant categories here. And what Massimini and colleagues have done, it's a fascinating piece of work, is they've looked at the capacity of the PCI to, as it were, validate those categories, if you like. So here, the different is the responsive PCI response of 8 subjects that are in, as it were, neurotypical subjects. And here is another, well, we've got 5 subjects. In one condition, they're, as it were, awake, conscious. In another, they're in non-REM sleep. And then you've got another 10 or 12 subjects who've been given different amounts of anesthetic. Propofol, for example, is one of the 3 anesthetics used. And contrasted with the same subject in a state of sedation versus a state of wakefulness. And what you see is that on the top line is independent of the intensity of the TMS, which is color-coded, or the location of the TMS, which is the shape. You get a clear PCI response of 0.5, 0.6, something like that. Whereas in the non-REM sleep state and in the sedated state, you get a PCI of what, 0.2, 0.3 at best. So there's a beautiful result, clear dissociation between PCI levels in wakeful state and the state of either sleep or sedation. So that's one kind of benchmarking study. And then another benchmarking study is to look at to take that data and benchmark it against or to use that to benchmark data from disorders of consciousness patients, a post-comatose patient. So here they had 2 locked-in syndrome patients, and you'd want these patients to turn out to have a high PCI because clinically they're understood to be fully alert and conscious. They just have difficulties in communicating and in voluntary behavior. And that, in fact, turns out to be the case. They're clearly above 0.6. You'd want VS, vegetative state or unresponsive wakefulness syndrome patients to have a low PCI, which does indeed turn out to be a case, the PCI of 0.2, 0.3 at best. And then patients who are minimally conscious or in the emerged from minimally conscious state, you'd want them to have PCIs somewhere in the middle, perhaps, or certainly higher than the VS UWS patients. And that also is what Massimini and his colleagues found. Again, relatively independent of the location of the TMS jolt. So that's, I think, a fascinating piece of work. And clearly at the back of it, you can see sort of a correlational methodology. The thought would be, why do we think someone in the VS state, for example, is unconscious? Well, because our ordinary pre-theoretical markers of consciousness, communication, report, the intentional control of behavior, these things are offline, these things are not present. So there's good evidence that the patient isn't conscious. And if the PCI results sort of correlate with that, that's taken to be some evidence that PCI is trustworthy. I think it's not hard to feel that there's something problematic about a correlational approach, and there's different ways of addressing the concern here, but here's one way in. How could PCI trump our pre-theoretical measures if our only evidence for thinking that PCI tracks consciousness derives from correlations between it and those measures? So this is, for me anyway, one of the main itches here that I feel needs scratching. Now you might say, look, we don't want a consciousness meter. We don't want something like the PCI machinery to be able to trump our pre-theoretical measures. We only want it to supplement them, to be useful where we can't apply our pre-theoretical measures. And that would be one response, but I think that would be pulling back on what we want from a fully fledged consciousness meter. We want something that could not only extend our capacity to measure consciousness, but can enable us to justifiably revise our pre-theoretical measures. So here's one way to sort of see this central problem. I mean, go back to this chart here. Take one of the VS patients. Now suppose, I mean, as it turned out, this patient 34 had a low PCI response of just over 0.2, I guess. Suppose that they had a very high PCI response. Suppose that they were up with the locked-in syndrome patients or the neurotypicals. Would that give us reason to say, oh, actually, we've got proof that the patient's conscious? I'm not sure that it would, but that's the kind of position that I think a well-validated consciousness meter should put us in. Or to go the other way, take the locked-in syndrome patient 51. In principle, we want a consciousness meter to be able to tell us that patient might not actually be conscious. So suppose that the PCI response wasn't, as it were, 0.6, but was down with the VS patients, 0.2, 0.3. Would that result then give us good reason to say, well, actually, this patient isn't, we might have other reason to think they're conscious, but now we've got good evidence that they're not conscious. Again, I don't think it would, because our only reason to trust PCI is because of correlations with our pre-theoretical measures. So I think the theory-based approaches are problematic, and PCI is not the only putative consciousness meter that appeals to theory, and the correlational approach is problematic for, broadly speaking, the reasons I just sketched. So we need a new approach. So what I want to do in the rest of my talk is sketch a new approach that Nick Shea and I call the natural kind strategy. And here are a couple of papers. The last reference there is a Ned Block's one of his very influential papers in behavioral and brain sciences. Ned doesn't talk about the approach using the phrase the natural kind strategy, but what he does do has a lot of similarities. It's a similar kind of approach to what we're doing here. So what's the idea? You treat consciousness like a natural kind property, familiar from discussions of, as it were, gold, water, or to use a more contemporary kind of case, COVID-19, a virus like that. It's a kind of property that explains why various features cluster together better than chance, and it supports induction to novel cases. So if you know something interesting about, say, gold, and you've discovered that gold behaves in this acid in a certain way, that the sample of gold behaves in this acid in a certain way, then you're justified in inferring that other samples of gold that you come across, even though they might have very different superficial properties, will behave in the same acid in the same way. So, if you discover, as we seem to have discovered, that people with COVID-19 have various, long-term damage with their lungs, then you might be justified in inferring that someone else who's been infected with COVID-19 is going to have that damage, or that's the idea. It underpins the practice of induction. The key thing is you avoid relying on pre-theoretical gold standards or definitive criteria. You don't look for them. You don't need them. It's really the clustering of features and the capacity for there to be an underlying property that explains why those features cluster together in the ways they do. That's at the heart of the natural kind of approach to measurement. So you really look at the heart of the approach. You're not looking for correlation with any one thing, and you're not looking for fit with theory. You're looking for nomological clusters, law-like clusters between putative markers of consciousness. And once you've identified that cluster of features, you're looking for the underlying properties, like a virus in the case of COVID-19, that might underlie it and regulate it, that might play a role in explaining why these features, coughing, having a fever, whatever they are reliably associated with each other in the ways that they are. And of course, once you've got that property, you can then intervene on it. And if that property does explain the clustering of the high-level features, then interventions on it are going to have systematic effects on the associated features. So, I mean, one picture here, which I quite like, comes from the work of Muhammad Ali Khalidi, where he talks about natural kinds as nodes in causal networks. So you've got a whole network of causal relations between things, and there'll be underlying nodes that play key roles in the interaction between those other, as it were, nodes. And if you think of consciousness as a natural kind, you're thinking of it as a key node that explains the interactions between other nodes. I mean, when you think of it, it's kind of puzzling why the natural kind strategy hasn't really been systematically pursued in consciousness science. It is the default strategy of science, at least of the biological sciences. It's used, applied in medical contexts every day of the week, but it's been, I think, largely ignored in the study of consciousness, and it's sort of puzzling as to why that might be. So what I want to do in the last, I guess, 20 minutes or so is just run through 3 reasons to think that it can't be applied to consciousness, that in some ways it might be dead in the water. And so this is sort of ground clearing, simultaneously ground clearing to sort of try and make a clear way for the view, but also to explain why the approach has been relatively neglected. So 3 objections to the natural kind strategy. There are others, no doubt, but these are 3 that are, I think, in many ways the most pressing. So here's the first objection. We know that in difficult cases, some of the pre-theoretical features associated with consciousness are going to be present and others are going to be absent. I mean, in part, it sort of follows from what it is to be a difficult case. If all the pre-theoretical features associated with consciousness are present, then you're an easy case for, yes, you're conscious. If all the pre-theoretical features are absent, then you're an easy case for, no, you're not conscious. It's only when some are present and some are absent that you're a difficult case. So in such cases, we can't expect the natural kind method to deliver an unequivocal verdict. So we start off being unsure in this state of uncertainty. The thought would be, well, we can't get beyond that. And so the natural kind strategy can't render the difficult cases any more tractable than they are without it. Now, I think it's clear that there's got to be something wrong with this objection, because if it was any good, then it would apply across the board to other kinds of cases of measurement and detection. I mean, so suppose you wake up tomorrow and you've got some of the symptoms associated with COVID-19. Maybe you've got a runny nose or slight fever, but you don't have other of the symptoms. So you might think, well, I mean, I'm not a clear yes, but I'm also not a clear no. If the argument I just gave were right, then you ought not to be able to, as it were, pursue the natural kind strategy to clear up your confusion. You wouldn't be able to get anywhere. You'd still be in a state of uncertainty. But clearly you can, right? You can get a medical test, and the test will hopefully say that you don't have it, or it might say that you are positive for COVID-19. So, it's a familiar story that you can resolve uncertainty using detection methods in this kind of case. So why couldn't it work for consciousness as well? In a nutshell, the solution is that we just put more weight on the underlying property that regulates the nomological cluster on the natural kind property than we do on particular elements of the cluster. And we're perfectly happy. We're happy to say, look, I've got COVID-19, but I'm asymptomatic. There's nothing incoherent in that. This is the kind of thing people say. Or we can say, look, I've got all the symptoms, but I actually don't have it because I don't have the underlying property. So if you were to apply the consciousness, the natural kind strategy to consciousness science consistently and coherently, then ought to be prepared to say the same thing about consciousness. And that's so that's the first objection. Second objection goes roughly like this: consciousness isn't a natural kind. The natural kind strategy could succeed only if consciousness were a natural kind. So the natural kind strategy can't succeed. So I think there's two very different ways of developing this objection. One way focuses on kind of a dualist thought that, well, consciousness is not a material, it's not a physical kind, therefore it can't be a natural kind, at least not in the way that gold or hepatitis or COVID-19 are natural kinds. It just doesn't have that kind of metaphysical status. I'm going to not say anything more about that version of the objection, other than I won't say anything more about it other than I think the natural kind strategy is perfectly consistent with dualism. All you need to say is not that consciousness itself is a natural kind in the ordinary physical sense of being a natural kind, but that it marches lockstep with a physical natural kind. And most dualists are happy to say there's a physical property, that consciousness isn't a physical property, but there's a physical property that marches lockstep with it. So I think the dualist version can be handled. It doesn't trouble me. I think a more interesting, a more potentially troubling version of this objection comes from the limitivist worries that in some sense, consciousness, the term fails to refer because there are too many natural kinds in the vicinity. There's not one natural kind that regulates the cluster. Or maybe another way of actually, at the end of the day, another way of saying the same thing. There's no single overarching natural kind. There's just a motley assortment of properties. But there's nothing, it's not just like there's hepatitis A, hepatitis B, hepatitis C. We can't even split the concept and come up with multiple natural kinds. There's just a motley assortment of properties here, really. Patricia Churchland at one point sketched some version of that worry. More recently, Liz Irvine has been pushing this worry. I think it needs to be taken seriously, but I don't think we don't know enough about consciousness. We haven't really prosecuted the natural kind strategy sufficiently in depth to know whether to know whether it's a natural kind or not, or to know whether it's natural kind-ish. So I think this is a genuine worry, but I don't think it provides us with any reason to give up on the natural kind strategy right now. Oh, sorry, I've just gone over that. So objection 3 is, I think, in many ways where the action is. So let me just wind things up by saying a little bit about a final objection. Here's a first stab at the objection. Consciousness, as it were, the concept of consciousness is not a natural kind concept. The natural kind strategy presupposes that the concept of consciousness, so I'm using small caps here for concepts, not for properties in the world, not for things in the world, but for concepts. The natural kind strategy presupposes that the concept of consciousness is a natural kind concept, so the natural kind strategy is not viable. Again, we've got a valid argument. We just need to think about the truth of the premises. And in particular, we need to think about, well, what is a natural kind concept anyway? So I think there's two notions of a natural kind concept that might be usefully distinguished and disentangled. In one sense, a concept's a natural kind concept. I'm going to call this the externalist sense, if the thing that it refers to in the world is a natural kind. So dirt, the concept of dirt, isn't a natural kind concept because, yeah, there is such a thing as dirt. The room I'm in probably needs a sweep, but it's not a natural kind. There's no science of dirt. There's no underlying nature to dirt. Dirt doesn't really support induction to novel cases in the way that natural kinds do. It doesn't regulate a cluster of properties in the way that good, genuine natural kinds do. So the concept of dirt isn't a natural kind concept. There's another conception of a natural kind concept, which I'm going to call the internalist conception. If the concept itself functions in reasoning, in thought, in communication, in the way that other natural kind concepts do. So this is not a deflationary analysis or definition, but it's sort of a point you in the direction of such a thing. So take hepatitis. The concept of hepatitis is the concept of something that is a natural kind. And the thought would be consciousness is a natural kind in that sense, if its semantic role, if its role in reasoning and thought, communication, sort of patterns with the role of, say, hepatitis, where we think of hepatitis as something that's out there in the world that can regulate clusters of observable properties and support induction to new cases. Now, I think it's pretty clear that the objection under discussion assumes an internalist conception of natural kind concepts. I mean, if it was focused on the first sense of a natural kind concept, the externalist sense, then it's really question begging. We don't really get anywhere with this objection. It's really the internalist conception of the natural kind concept that's in play here. In a nutshell, the thought is, the worry is, we don't think of consciousness as a natural kind. That's not part of the ordinary concept of consciousness. And we would have to think of it as a natural kind in order for the natural kind strategy to work. That's the basic idea. So is the concept of consciousness rather a natural kind concept in this sense? Well, here's a couple of reasons that when I first started thinking about this stuff, motivated me to say yes. One is that consciousness is a biological, psychological phenomenon, and I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say that most concepts we have of biological, psychological states are natural kind concepts. Not everyone's going to sign up to that. There are analyses of concepts of psychological phenomena which don't paint them as natural kinds. Behaviorists had such analyses that weren't natural kind analyses. But within cognitive science, I think it's relatively generally widely assumed that such concepts are natural kind. And perhaps more weight is the fact that consciousness is generally taken to be an appropriate object of empirical investigation. We think there can be a science of consciousness, or at least to the extent that one thinks there can be a science of consciousness. That's pretty good reason to think that you're committed to thinking that consciousness, the concept of consciousness, is a natural kind concept. We don't think there can be a science of dirt. We don't think there can be a science of weeds. and partly because we don't think of these concepts as functioning as natural kind concepts. That's the yes, but what I want to do now is point out that there's a very influential tradition of philosophy which argues that consciousness isn't a natural kind concept. And this is where the force of the objection that I'm considering here comes from. So you may be familiar with Frank Jackson's knowledge argument, his example of Mary in her black and white room. So here's Mary. She's the world's foremost neuroscientist of vision, especially of color vision, but she's spent her whole life in a black and white room, achromatic room. She knows everything there is to know about the neuroscience of color vision. But Frank Jackson says in the knowledge argument, there's something that she doesn't know and that she can't work out from all her scientific knowledge of color, of the science of color vision, namely what it's like to see red. So facts about experiences, phenomenal facts as they're often called, are outside her grasp. They elude her. Why do they elude her? Jackson and many others have said, is because those facts can be grasped or are appropriately grasped via a special kind of concept, which have come to be known as a phenomenal concept. And phenomenal concepts are unique. They have a bunch of interesting features that other concepts don't. They can be acquired only by having the relevant kind of experience. So it's only when Mary leaves her black and white room and sees tomatoes and red flags that she acquires the capacity to think about red experiences. They're not inferentially integrated with other concepts, especially, as it were, scientific concepts. So all the knowledge that she can gain, all the book learning that she can acquire, all the theoretical knowledge that she can have isn't going to give her the capacity to work out what it's like to see red. It's not going to enable her to think about experiences of red. And they can be authoritatively self-applied merely by having the relevant kind of property. You don't need, as it were, third-person evidence to know that you're seeing red. As long as you've got the concept, you can apply it with authority to yourself and say, I am seeing red or I'm not seeing red. I am in pain or I'm not in pain. So they have distinctive acquisition conditions. They're kind of autonomous and they can be authoritatively self-applied. And natural kind concepts don't appear to have any of these properties. They can be learned. You don't have to have direct experience or direct acquaintance with genes to be able to learn about genes. They're not autonomous from other concepts, other theoretical concepts. So you can acquire the concept gene by book learning. That's how almost all of us do acquire the concept. And they can't be authoritatively self-applied merely by instantiating the relevant kind of property. I mean, I might have a gene for something, but I'm not authoritative in ascribing that property to myself merely by having the gene for it. So there's some pretty fundamental differences between phenomenal concepts on the one hand and natural kind concepts. And now that gives us the opportunity with this distinction in hand to rephrase objection 3, to repitch it. Here's the thought. The concept of consciousness is a phenomenal concept, right? It has these distinctive features that we just outlined. If it's a phenomenal concept, then it's not a natural kind concept. So it's not a natural kind concept. That's valid. The natural kind strategy could be successful only if consciousness were a natural kind concept. Therefore, it can't be successful. So what should we say about this objection? And I think just before I mention a couple of ways you might respond to it, I suspect that it's rarely articulated, but I think some kind of implicit commitment to this objection is sort of behind philosophical resistance in natural kind strategy. So one thing you might do is reject premise 4. So one of my collaborator, Nick Shea, is relatively keen on rejecting premise 4 of the argument. I myself am more inclined to reject premise 2. So I'm inclined to say consciousness could be, so that should be the concept of consciousness, both a phenomenal concept So I accept there are phenomenal concepts, and I'm happy to grant that the concept of consciousness is a phenomenal concept, and a kind of atypical natural kind concept. So all of the features that I suggested natural kind concepts have, I certainly, so being able to be learnt by books and the like, I had by typical natural kind concepts, but it's not clear that they're definitive of being a natural kind concept. So I'm inclined to suggest that it's both a phenomenal concept and a really idiosyncratic natural kind concept. And the key point is this: I think we do ordinarily think of consciousness as a node in a causal network. And once you think of it in those terms, you're committed to thinking of it in some way as a natural kind concept, I think. Okay, concluding thoughts. Let me wrap up quickly. Philosophers often deny or say things that commit themselves to denying that consciousness is a natural kind. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, scientists, I think, generally view consciousness as a natural kind, but they don't appreciate the methodological consequences of that view, the consequences for thinking about how to validate a consciousness meter. And what I've tried to suggest here is that although the challenges posed by detecting consciousness, validating the consciousness meter are really tough, they can be met by treating consciousness as a natural kind and following through on the implications of that commitment in the way that scientists often haven't. All right, let me finish there. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Tim. We have so far a couple of questions, I think, on the perturbational complexity index. But please keep the questions coming.
Should I stop sharing, Lisa?
If you like, maybe.
I don't know about other people, but I'm getting a lot of feedback again. So.
Oh no.
Anyway.
Let me just try and ask this question quickly, and hopefully you can hear it. So Martin Seligman asks, System 2 deliberation might generate a more complex signal than System 1 intuition. Is deliberation more conscious than intuition?
Right. That's a great question. I'm going to have to turn the volume down because I'm hearing myself back really loudly. So let me just do that. So that's a great question because what you need to do is factor out the complexity inherent in the content, as it were. So if System 2 states are inherently complex because of their cognitive content, for let's say, and System 1 states are less complex because they've got, as it were, simpler processing involved. Let's put it that way. Here's how I think of it. You want to say, well, I want to screen off the complexity that is associated with the content and the processing, and I want to focus on what's left over and use that as a marker of consciousness. And I think it's a great question because intuitively, so here's one way to think about it. Pitch a very simple sense, as it were, a very simple sensation, which is conscious, against a very complex but unconscious logical, reasoning, for example. Now, if you can have complex but unconscious cognition and simple but conscious sensation, how could complexity per se give you a guide to consciousness? I think that's a good challenge for things like the PCI. There's a whole lot to say here, and I'm aware that other people have got questions. I guess one thing to say would be the focus of the PCI is on global states, or what they call levels of consciousness, and not a particular contents. So once that's the focus, then the nature of this challenge becomes a little bit different, because you're not asking, is this content conscious? You're asking, is this organism conscious? But that's only a partial answer. That's not a full answer to the question, I think. I think that's a good challenge for any complexity
Thanks.
approach to consciousness. Yeah.
Thanks. So I think maybe what you said has some bearing on this question, but it has 4 votes, so I want to make sure it gets asked. Do you consider consciousness to be on a continuum? How does that fit into the natural kind approach? In other words, does something happen to push from unconsciousness to consciousness? Perhaps this is related to the eliminativism arguments.
Right. So, okay, I'm going to mute myself again. It's a great question. I was just on a Zoom seminar with some animal consciousness people yesterday, i.e. 6 hours ago, when this issue came up in connection with properties like species. So if you think, I mean, here's one way to think about it. So I think in terms of degrees of consciousness and vagueness of consciousness, I think the natural kind approach is, in principle, neutral. It's not committed either way. It allows for there to be indeterminate cases and for consciousness to come in degrees. And it also allows, because there could be natural kinds that have hard borders and that don't come in degrees. So I think in principle, the approach is sort of not committed on those issues. In practice, I think it's hard to resist the thought, at least this is how I would put it, it's hard to resist the thought that we're going to get degrees and we're going to get lots of indeterminacy and fuzzy borders. Because the kinds of natural kinds that you see in the life sciences have fuzzy borders. So other properties that are natural kindish in the vicinity, like life, like species, all of these things don't seem to be the kinds of natural kinds that you might get in, say, chemistry or physics, which are perhaps have sharper borders, sharper edges. And so taking this approach, I mean, there's some folks, both in philosophy and science, who say, there's a hard and sharp distinction between things that are conscious and things that are not conscious, that the circle of sentience, as it were, has sharp borders. Now, that could be right. It's consistent to hold that view and to endorse the natural kind strategy. But I think the natural direction in which the natural kind approach pushes you puts pressure on that assumption. Yeah, I guess that's where I would leave things.
Thanks. So I think since we started a couple minutes late, we have time for one more question. Sophie Rogers asks, don't complex systems like conscious creatures tend to act very differently in the same situation due to underlying stochasticity in the system? What reason do we have to think that 2 conscious creatures will have the same cluster of properties in virtue of their being conscious as opposed to their being Homo sapien, etc.? Might complexity be the property? Yeah. So yeah. Yeah.
So that, I'm going to mute myself again. That's a great question. Right. So what one needs to do here is what one's going to have to do in any context when one's thinking in sort of natural kind terms, is lock on to those properties that are definitive of the kind, as it were, that are essential to the kind, and those that are contingent to its particular instances. So, suppose I have 2 chickens in the room here. They're going to have different features. One of them might be older than the other. One of them might be born in Australia. The other one might be from Pennsylvania. One of them might be male. One of them might be female. One of them might be short. One of them might be tall. You get the idea. And then they'll have so those are, as it were, not tracking the natural kind property of being a chicken. Those are differences that can be seen in different instances of the chickenhood kind. And then there'll be properties that are, as it were, definitive of being a chicken, such that, if I give this chicken this drug for hepatitis, supposing the chickens can get hepatitis, and it's effective, then it gives me some reason to think that this same drug will be effective in other chickens. So there are properties that, as it were, project, that one can reliably project across members of a kind, and there are properties I mean, the fact that this chicken was born in Melbourne doesn't give me any reason to think that this chicken was born in Melbourne. And so what one needs to do in consciousness science, and it's a great question because there's a real difficult problem here, is work out what are those features that are, as it were, contingent to my consciousness, as it were, the cognitive, behavioral, computational properties that are definitive of my consciousness, but don't really track the kind at all. And it's particularly a difficult problem because we're forced with consciousness to start with our own species, and not just our own species, but adult members of our own species, and not just adult members of our own species, but neurotypical adult members of our own species, and probably neurotypical members of our own species in the state of waking consciousness. So we start with this very small set of cases, and we've got this really difficult challenge of working out, well, what are the features of consciousness that are just associated with that cluster of with that sample, and which are the features that are we can project from that sample to all human beings, not just adults, to all mammals, and even to AI systems or cerebral organoids or what have you. Now, I think there's a few things one might do, but now we're getting down in the weeds, and we're perhaps getting over time. But it's a challenge for the natural kind approach. I think, is it worse for the natural kind approach? Does the natural kind strategy have tools that the other strategies don't have? I think so, but I certainly didn't make the case for that here.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. And you can't hear everyone else, but there are lots of claps in the chat. And I think, yeah, thank you so much. And I think Heather has a couple announcements to make before we end.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking to us from the future, and I hope you have a good weekend. We'll be there tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. I'll just post the link. Our speaker next week is going to be, I just posted it and I've already forgotten it. Michael Tomasello is joining us from Duke. Sorry, let me correct myself. We are not having a talk next week because it is the American Thanksgiving. On December 4th, we'll be joined by Michael Tomasello. And then on December 11th, we have Nick Chater. We are also, then we'll have a break for the holidays, and we will resume in February. You can follow us using the link above to hear about upcoming talks. And then I had mentioned this last week, but we also are hiring postdocs, MindCORE research fellows that are working in the interdisciplinary science of mind and brain at the University of Pennsylvania. It's a great opportunity, and I'll post a link to that. You're welcome to share it. Thank you again for joining us today, and go back to bed.
Thanks, everyone. That's a great lineup. Honored to be in that company. Bye. Thanks, Lisa.
Take care. Thanks,
Okay.
Tim.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.